Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a real classic in the world of psychology, B.F. Skinner's The Behavior of Organisms.
Yeah, a book that really kind of set the stage for a lot of modern behavioral science.
Yeah, our listeners really interested in learning about the science of behavior, and I think this is going to be a great place to start.
It could be a pretty dense book.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. But I think we can break it down, make it accessible and show how these concepts that Skinner talks about, things like reflexes and how our actions are shaped by their consequences, how these actually apply to everyday life.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about Skinner's work is just how revolutionary it was at the time. I mean, this book came out in 1938, and he was already challenging a lot of the assumptions about how we should study behavior.
Yeah, so what was so radical about his approach?
Well, back then, many scientists thought that behavior was just too subjective, too messy to really study scientifically. They preferred to focus on things that they could easily measure, like reaction times or physiological responses. But Skinner, he came along and insisted that we could be just as rigorous in studying behavior itself.
So instead of asking people, what they were thinking or feeling, he just focused on what they were actually doing.
Exactly, yeah. And to do that, he had to be really precise with his language.
I see, yeah.
He believed in what are called operational definitions, which means defining things based on how you actually measure them.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, the rat is hungry, he would say, the rat hasn't eaten in 24 hours and will press this lever a certain number of times to get food.
Oh, so just like taking the guesswork out of it,
Exactly.
making everything crystal clear.
Yeah.
So if we're trying to understand behavior scientifically, where do we even begin? Like, what are the basic building blocks we should be looking at?
Well, Skinner starts with reflexes, those kind of automatic responses to specific stimuli. So think about the knee-jerk reaction you get when the doctor taps on your knee with that little hammer.
Yeah.
That's a reflex. It's a simple, reliable relationship between a stimulus and a response.
But obviously our behavior is not all just knee-jerk reactions, right?
Right, and that's where things get really interesting because Skinner, he distinguished between two types of reflexes.
Okay.
He called them respondents and operants.
Uh-huh.
Respondents, those are the simple automatic responses like pulling your hand away from a hot stove.
Right.
But operants are different. Operants are actions that operate on the environment to produce some kind of consequence.
Okay.
So think of a bird pecking at a seed to get food.
Right.
Or, going back to that rat, pressing a lever to get a treat.
Uh-huh. So an action that leads to a consequence of some kind.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm guessing this leads us to like the big idea here, operant conditioning, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Operant
Wow.
conditioning is all about how those consequences, the results of those actions, shape our behavior. So if a behavior leads to something pleasant or rewarding, we're more likely to do it again.
Okay.
If it leads to something unpleasant or punishing, we're less likely to repeat it.
Right. So it's like this constant kind of feedback loop between our actions and the environment.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a dance. We're constantly adjusting our behavior based on the feedback we get from the world around us.
So how does this actually work in real life? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about how we learn to speak. As babies, we just make all sorts of sounds, right? Just random noises.
Yeah.
But when we happen to make a sound that resembles a word, our parents get all excited and they give us attention and praise.
Right. Yeah. So it's like rewarding.
It's a reward, yeah. And that positive reinforcement encourages us to keep making those sounds.
Yeah.
And eventually we learn to form words and then sentences.
So it's like our parents are shaping our behavior without even realizing it.
Exactly, yeah. They're the original behaviorists.
And it's amazing how this simple principle, this idea of reinforcement, can have such a powerful effect.
It really is, yeah.
So we've talked about reinforcement.
Yeah,
I imagine extinction also plays a pretty crucial role here.
it does, yeah. Extinction is what happens when a behavior that was previously reinforced is no longer followed by that reward.
Huh?
So remember that rat pressing the lever for food?
Yeah.
What if we stopped giving the rat food when it presses the lever?
I imagine eventually it would stop pressing it, right?
Yeah, eventually the behavior would be extinguished because it's no longer producing that desired consequence.
Right. So if you want to break a bad habit, you basically need to figure out what's reinforcing it and then remove that reinforcement.
Yeah, you got it.
And that's easier said than done sometimes, but it's the basic principle.
It is, yeah. And it's not always easy to identify those reinforcers because sometimes they're really subtle.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's just the feeling of relief you get when you avoid doing something that makes you anxious.
Right, right.
But once you identify that reinforcer,
Hmm.
you can start to chip away at the behavior.
Okay, so we got reinforcement, extinction. Pretty straightforward. Are there any other kind of like tricks of the trade that Skinner came up with that we should know about?
Well, there's this fascinating finding about what happens when we reinforce a behavior only periodically, not every single time it occurs. So let's go back to that rat and its lever.
Okay.
What if, instead of giving it food every time it presses the lever, we only gave it food, say, every other time, or even less frequently?
Hmm. I'm guessing it would still keep pressing the lever, hoping for that reward.
Yeah, you're exactly right. What's amazing is that this periodic reinforcement, this giving a reward only sometimes, can create incredibly persistent behavior.
Hmm. Okay, that's interesting.
Think about slot machines.
Yeah, okay.
You might not win big every time you pull that lever,
Right.
but that occasional jackpot keeps people hooked.
Yeah, it's like the unpredictability of the reward somehow makes the behavior stronger.
It does.
That's a little counterintuitive.
It is. It is. But it explains why certain behaviors, especially those involving addiction, can be so difficult to break. It's that uncertainty of the reward that keeps us coming back for more, even when we know it might not be in our best interest.
Yeah.
And it's not just slot machines, it's all around us. Think about social media, think about checking your phone for notification.
Oh, yeah, that's a good
You
example.
don't know if you're going to get a like or a comment every time you check, but those occasional little bursts of social validation, they keep us coming back for more.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that. So we've talked about reinforcement, extinction, and now this kind of like the power of periodic reinforcement. It's amazing how these simple principles can really explain so much about our everyday behavior.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
What else do we need to know about, how our behavior is shaped?
Well, we don't just blindly respond to every stimulus we encounter. We learn to discriminate, to
Yeah.
tell the difference between situations where a particular behavior will be rewarded and situations where it won't.
Right, so it's not just the behavior itself, it's the context in which it occurs.
Exactly,
Like
exactly.
that rat, it learned to only press the lever when the light was on because that was the signal that pressing the lever would lead to food.
Yeah, exactly. It figured out that the light was kind of like a green light, a signal that its actions would be rewarded. And that ability to discriminate, to kind of fine-tune our responses based on subtle cues in the environment is essential for learning and adapting to all sorts of situations.
Right, so it's like learning a new skill.
Yeah,
You might start out a bit clumsy, but with practice, you get more precise. You learn to discriminate between the movements that work and the movements that don't.
exactly. And it's the same with our behavior in social situations. We learn to read people's facial expressions, their body language, their tone of voice, and we adjust our behavior accordingly.
So it's not just about the action, it's about the information that surrounds that action.
It's about the whole package.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got consequences, context, this ability to discriminate between different situations. What other factors play a role here?
Well, one really crucial variable is drive.
Drive. You mean like motivation?
Exactly, yeah. Think about hunger, thirst, or even the drive to escape an uncomfortable situation. These are internal states that can have a powerful influence on our behavior.
So a hungry rat is going to work harder for food than a rat that just ate.
Exactly, yeah. Skinner's experiments showed that the strength of our behavior is directly related to the strength of our drive. The more motivated we are, the more likely we are to act.
Makes sense. But how do we measure something like hunger or thirst? Can't we just ask someone, how hungry are you?
Well, Skinner believed that the best way to measure drive was to observe behavior, not to rely on self-reports, because those can be unreliable. People aren't always aware of their own motivations.
Right.
So instead of asking someone how hungry they are, he would look at how much effort they would expend to get food.
I see. So we can infer the level of someone's hunger by observing, how vigorously they eat or how much effort they'll put into getting food.
Exactly, yeah. And this approach can be applied to all sorts of drives, not just hunger and thirst. We can look at how much effort someone puts into getting a promotion at work or finding a romantic partner.
So we're talking about motivation in a much broader sense. It's not just about, basic physiological needs. It's about like social and psychological desires as well.
Exactly. It's about anything that drives us to act. And this is where things get really interesting because Skinner's research suggests that our drives are not always simple or straightforward.
Hmm.
Remember those subhungers we talked about earlier?
No, we haven't talked about those yet, but go ahead.
Okay, well, Skinner proposed that there might be multiple drives operating at any given time, each with its own specific influence on our behavior.
Okay.
So it's not just like there's one big hunger drive that controls all of our food-seeking behavior.
Right.
There might be separate drives for specific types of food, like a drive for salty snacks or a drive for sweet treats.
Hmm. That's interesting. So I could be craving chocolate even if I just had a big meal.
Exactly, yeah. And these drives can interact in complex ways, sometimes competing with each other.
Okay, so it's like a little committee in our brains, all these different drives vying for our attention.
Yeah, it's a constant tug of war.
Yeah.
And it's not always clear which drive is going to win out. And this raises all sorts of questions about how we prioritize and balance these different drives and how the environment influences which drives become more prominent at any given moment.
Right, right. Yeah, so like if I'm feeling both hungry and tired, my behavior might reflect a combination of those two drives. Like I might be less motivated to cook a meal, but very motivated to order takeout.
Exactly, yeah. And that's a great example of how our internal states interact with the environment to shape our behavior. The availability of takeout food makes it much easier to satisfy your hunger drive without having to expend a lot of effort.
Right, so it's not just about willpower.
No, it's not just about willpower. It's about the opportunities and constraints that surround us. If takeout wasn't an option, you might be more inclined to cook something, even if you're tired.
Yeah, so Skinner's view of drives is kind of like it's a bit more nuanced than the way we typically think about motivation, right?
Yeah.
Like in everyday language, we often talk about motivation as something internal, something that pushes us to act.
Yeah, we say things like, I'm just not motivated to go to the gym today.
Yeah.
But Skinner's approach is more about the interplay between those internal states
hmm
and the external influences.
So it's not just about what we want, but also about the opportunities and constraints of our environment.
Precisely. Yeah. Think of it this way. You might have a really strong desire to learn a new language.
Okay.
But if you don't have access to resources like classes or language learning apps,
hmm
or if you don't have the time to devote to studying, that drive might not translate into actual behavior.
Right.
So it's not just about willpower, it's about opportunity. It's a dynamic interaction between our inner world and the world around us.
Yeah, and that's something that I think is often overlooked when we're talking about motivation. We tend to blame ourselves, if we're not achieving our goals.
Yeah.
But Skinner's work suggests that it's not always that simple. Sometimes the environment is just not set up to support the behaviors that we want to engage in.
Right. And that's where Skinner's work becomes really practical because it suggests that we can create environments that foster motivation and support behavior change.
So it's less about telling someone to, like, try harder
Yeah.
and more about thinking about how to structure their environment to make it easier for them to succeed.
Exactly. Yeah. By understanding the principles of reinforcement, extinction, and shaping, we can create environments that nudge people toward positive behaviors and help them overcome those challenges.
So this is starting to sound less like, a science of behavior and more like a blueprint for like a better world.
Well, in a way, that's what Skinner was aiming for. He believed that a deeper understanding of behavior could lead to more effective ways of addressing social problems and creating a more just and humane society.
Wow. It's an inspiring vision,
Yeah.
one that highlights the potential of behavioral science to not just understand the world, but to change it for the better. But, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive already. I think maybe it's time to pause here and give you some time to digest all of this information. We'll pick up the conversation in part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into Skinner's ideas.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Welcome back to our deep dive into B.F. Skinner's The Behavior of Organisms. Before the break, we were talking about drives, those internal forces that kind of push and pull us in different directions.
Right, and how those drives work together with the environment to shape how we act. It's not just about what we want, but also about what's around us, the opportunities and constraints.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I want to learn a new language, I might have the desire, but if I don't have the time or resources, it's just not going to happen.
Exactly. And, that leads us to another key piece of Skinner's framework, the concept of emotion.
Okay.
Now, this might sound a little strange at first, but Skinner didn't think of emotions like as these separate little things inside us that cause our behavior.
Mm.
Instead, he saw them more as like changes in our overall behavioral tendencies, often linked to changes in our physiology.
Okay, so instead of saying, I feel anxious, therefore I avoid social situations, Skinner would say something like, My anxiety, which we can see in my body, like maybe a faster heart rate,
Right.
leads me to avoid things that make me uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's like flipping the cause and effect around.
Yeah.
He saw emotions as like part of the whole behavior package,
Hmm.
influenced by stuff both inside and outside of us. And to really get this, we need to talk about his experiments with drugs.
Ooh, okay.
Now, this is where it gets interesting.
Tell me more about these experiments.
Well, Skinner and his colleagues, they did some fascinating work with drugs like caffeine and benzodrine,
Yeah.
looking at how they affected the behavior of rats. And they found that even small doses of caffeine, like a little cup of coffee,
Mhm.
could significantly increase how often the rats pressed the lever for food, like suggesting a link between the drug and like an increase in the hunger drive.
So caffeine makes you more motivated to get food even if you're not actually that hungry?
Yeah,
I think I can relate to that.
right.
Sometimes when I have a cup of coffee, I definitely want a snack afterward.
Exactly. And the benzodrine experiments, they were even more interesting. They found that benzodrine could increase lever pressing even in rats that were completely full. They weren't hungry at all. It's like the drug was somehow bypassing the whole, like the normal hunger mechanism,
Yeah.
and directly affecting the rat's motivation to press that lever.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. So you're saying we can like manipulate motivation by messing with brain chemistry?
Yeah, it's a really interesting finding. It raises questions about how our brains and bodies and behavior are all connected, you know?
Yeah.
And it shows that emotions, they're not just like these mysterious things we can't understand. They're linked to what's going on in our bodies, and they can be changed by stuff we're not even aware of.
Okay, so emotions definitely complex, but where does the brain itself fit into all this? I mean, didn't Skinner do any research on the nervous system?
He did some work on the autonomic nervous system, yeah, like looking at changes in blood pressure and heart rate, those kinds of conditioned responses.
Yeah.
But his main focus was always on what we could actually see the organism doing, not on trying to map out every single neuron in the brain.
So he wasn't saying the brain doesn't matter, but more like we can study behavior without needing to know all the details of how the brain works. Kind of like how I can drive my car without knowing exactly how the engine functions.
That's a great analogy. He believed that a science of behavior could stand on its own, you know, focusing on the connection between what we do and the consequences that follow,
Yeah.
without getting too lost in the details of brain activity.
Right. So, like, we can study how a river flows without needing to analyze the exact chemical makeup of each drop of water.
Yeah, exactly. And Skinner, he was especially skeptical of what he called explanatory fictions. Like these attempts to explain behavior by just inventing a mental process that we can't see or measure?
So instead of saying, the rat pressed the lever because it was hungry, they'd say, the rat pressed the lever because it had a mental image of food and a desire to get it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like adding a bunch of extra steps without really explaining anything new.
Exactly. And Skinner thought these kinds of explanations, they could lead to circular reasoning. Like, we see a behavior, then we invent a mental state to explain it, but then that mental state is just another way of describing the behavior we already saw.
Right, so it's like saying someone is generous because they have a generosity spot in their brain. Like we're just putting a fancy label on something without really understanding what's happening.
Exactly. Skinner thought we could make more progress by sticking to what we could actually observe and measure, the things in the environment that come before and after a behavior and how that changes whether the behavior happens again.
Okay, so we've covered drives, emotions, even touched on the brain, but I'm still curious how all this applies to human behavior, in the real world, not just rats in a lab.
That's a great question. And Skinner, he actually devoted a lot of his work to that, to figuring out how these principles apply to people.
So you're saying that things like love, hate, creativity, all these complex human experiences, they can be understood through this lens of operant conditioning.
Yeah, Skinner definitely thought so. He believed that our thoughts, feelings, beliefs, they're all products of what we've learned, shaped by the consequences they've had in the past.
Okay, so I get that for simpler behaviors, like learning to ride a bike or brush my teeth. But what about those more complex things, like falling in love or writing a novel? Those don't seem like they can be explained by just, rewards and punishments.
That's where things get really interesting. Skinner recognized that human behavior is incredibly complex. He wasn't saying we can reduce it all to simple formulas, but he did think that these basic principles, reinforcement, extinction, discrimination, they play a role even in our most intricate thoughts and feelings and actions.
So it's not like there's one set of rules for simple behaviors and a completely different set for complex ones. It's more like These basic principles are at work on different levels, interacting with our genes and our environment.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's like those basic learning principles are woven into the fabric of our experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most important things that Skinner's work shows us. It reminds us that even our strongest beliefs, our emotions, our creativity, they're not things that just appear out of nowhere.
Yeah.
They're shaped by how we interact with the world.
That's a powerful thought. It's kind of like saying we have more control over our lives than we might realize.
Exactly. And it also suggests that we have a responsibility to make environments that help people thrive,
Mm.
both for ourselves and for others.
Okay, so how do we actually put this into practice? How can we use this knowledge to live better, to raise happier kids, build stronger communities?
That's what's so exciting. Skinner's work gives us this toolbox of strategies for changing behavior. We've talked about reinforcement and extinction, but there are other techniques too.
Give me some examples. How can we use this to make a real difference?
Well, there's this powerful technique called shaping. It's all about breaking down a complex behavior into smaller steps and then encouraging each step along the way.
So if I'm teaching a kid to tie their shoes, I don't just expect them to get it perfect right away.
Right, we break it down. We praise them for each little success until they can do it on their own.
So it's like building a staircase, one step at a
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, shaping can be used for all kinds of things. Learning new skills, breaking bad habits, reaching goals.
Okay, I can see how that would be helpful. But what about really tough behaviors, like addiction or aggression?
There are ways to tackle those too. One approach is called differential reinforcement. We encourage the good behaviors and ignore or try to get rid of the bad ones. So if a kid's acting out for attention, we might ignore the bad behavior and really praise them when they're acting well.
So it's about focusing more on the positive, less on punishment.
Exactly.
Mm.
And research shows this works better than just punishing bad behavior.
Makes sense. But what about when it's something really deep-seated, like behaviors that are part of a mental health condition? Can these principles still help?
Absolutely. Skinner's work has actually had a huge impact on clinical psychology. A lot of therapy approaches, like cognitive behavioral therapy, they're based on these principles of operant conditioning.
So even when it's something really ingrained, we can still use these ideas to help people change.
That's right. It shows how powerful and versatile Skinner's ideas are. He gave us a way to understand behavior that's both scientifically rigorous and really practical.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. We've explored these fundamental ideas of operant conditioning, delved into drives and emotions, even seen how this applies to things like therapy and social change.
It's been a great discussion.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface of what Skinner's work has to offer, though.
I agree. There's always more to learn.
Well, maybe we should give our listener a chance to absorb all this before we continue. We'll pick up where we left off in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been unpacking B.F. Skinner's The Behavior of Organisms and really getting a handle on how we learn and why we do the things we do.
Yeah, it's amazing how these ideas he had so long ago are still relevant, like helping us understand habits, social problems, all kinds of stuff.
Before we took a break, we were talking about the practical side of all this, how reinforcement, extinction, shaping, those tools can actually change behavior, even when it's tough, right? And one of the really cool things about Skinner's work is that it doesn't just stop with individuals. He thought these same principles could be used to understand, even change, the behavior of whole groups, like societies.
So we're not just talking about like teaching a dog to sit or helping someone quit smoking. Now we're getting into shaping culture, changing norms.
Exactly. Skinner argued that cultures, just like people, are shaped by a process of selection. The stuff that works for the group, it sticks around. The stuff that doesn't, it fades away.
It's like evolution, but for behaviors.
Exactly. And this idea can help us understand why some cultural things happen. Like think about sharing food in a community.
Okay.
That probably developed because it helped people survive when food was scarce, right?
So it wasn't just a random tradition, it served a purpose.
Yeah. And if cultures are shaped by consequences, then logically we can change cultures by changing those consequences, right?
Right. That's a pretty big idea. But how do we do that? How do we take these principles and use them to solve big problems?
One way is to design our social systems in a way that encourages good behaviors. Think about economic incentives. We can give tax breaks to companies that use green energy.
Or create programs in school that teach kids to be kind and cooperate, reduce bullying and stuff.
Exactly. It's about using these principles of operant conditioning on a bigger scale, right? Changing the results of actions, to nudge people in the right direction.
It kind of sounds like social engineering. Isn't that, like, ethically tricky?
It's a valid concern, yeah. We got to be careful about how we use this knowledge. But remember, we're already influenced by our surroundings all the time, right? Ads, social media, even how our cities are built, they all shape how we act, often without us even realizing it. So the question is, can we use this understanding to build environments that are good for people, that make the world better?
So it's about being intentional, not just letting things happen randomly, but designing things to support the kind of world we want.
Exactly. And there's a lot of evidence showing this works. Look at schools with cooperative learning. They have less bullying and better grades. Public health campaigns, they've helped get people to wear seatbelts, quit smoking.
So it's not just theory, it's real solutions that are already making a difference.
Exactly. And that's what makes Skinner so interesting. He didn't just give us a way to understand behavior. He gave us tools to make positive change.
It's empowering, We're not just stuck with whatever problems we face. We can actually do something about them.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest lessons from Skinner is that this power, it comes with responsibility. We have to use it wisely, ethically.
Yeah, it's like knowledge can be used for good or bad. We got to choose how we want to use it.
Well said.
We've gone from basic operant conditioning, to emotions, drives, even how to change society. It's been quite the deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Skinner's work showed us that our actions have consequences, and those consequences shape our behavior. So pay attention to those consequences. See how your choices affect you and the world around you, and use that knowledge to build the life you want for yourself and for everyone else. Thanks for joining us as we explored the fascinating world of B.F. Skinner.